The following program is made possible by the generous support of these sponsors. United Bank, with full-service banking for our community and our veterans from convenient locations. By PGBA, the healthcare claims processor for the American Armed Forces, serving those who serve us. And by Conway Ford, dedicated to serving our communities and our veterans in Horry, Georgetown, and Marion counties. From the campus of Coastal Carolina University, the Center for Military and Veteran Studies is pleased to present Military Memoirs. Hello and welcome to Military Memoirs. I'm Rod Gregg, and our program today has a special guest, Mr. Sam Jones Jr., who served with the U.S. Army Signal Corps during the Cold War. Pleasure to have you here, sir.
My pleasure to be here.
Now, you grew up, you were telling me earlier, in New Jersey.
Yes.
Any thoughts in your childhood that you might want to join the military?
Yes. Being right on the coast, we saw activity out on the horizon of a ship being blasted, I guess, or torpedoed. You'd see a little glow, and we had Coast Guard patrolling the beach.
This was World War II.
World War II, and we were near Fort Monmouth, so we had troops sometime lining the beach and maneuvers. That didn't go on very long, but at the beginning of the war, and there was troop trains passed within a couple of blocks of my house. And sometimes they'd stop, and I'd go over there as a kid, and they'd give me a quarter, and I'd run over to the grocery store and buy them candy, and then go and hand it in the window to them.
Right.
So I was familiar, and I had some uncles that were drafted in the military. My father was, and my father worked we moved to Fort Bragg after, my father had a business on Ocean Avenue, and my mother was from North Carolina, and we just thought it would be best to get away from the coast early in the war.
Okay, in World War II. So
Yeah,
you were growing up on the coast of New Jersey.
Yes. So
and where exactly did you grow up?
Long Branch, New Jersey.
All right, and what was that like in the early 40s?
It was tense. They had maneuvers, and they had a big blockhouse they built about 3 stories high right on the ocean front for observation, and they would have different maneuvers. And I one time saw some tanks going by my house, but that was only one time. And that only lasted, and our automobile lights were painted black, the upper half. Mm-hmm. And so were all the street lights along the Ocean Drive. The part facing the ocean was all painted black. We had air raid drills, and where we had to turn off all the lights in the house, and we had air raid wardens that made sure you did that.
Well, it was blackout, particularly significant on the coast.
Yes.
During World War II, because if the lights were all on, then it really would silhouette ships, and German submarines would have easier targets, correct?
Something like that. Like I said, the only thing we did as children, I would sometime walk the beach to get to school. It was about 1.5 miles to school. We would leave Ocean Avenue, go walk down the beach, the sand, and then cut back into school. And one morning down there, we found this huge life raft. And in the center was a compartment. We opened it up. We saw all kind of survival gear in there. And we quickly ran back and told one of the parents. They called the police. The police called Fort Monmouth. They told us to get away, get out of there. So we went on to school. And when we came back in the evening, it was pulled way up on the shore, and all the goodies that were in this compartment, which we could have laid claim to, I think, were gone. And the next day, Fort Monmouth people came over and removed.
Well, this wartime
lifestyle during World War II included rationing and victory gardens and scrap drives and all kinds of things. Were you caught up in that as a boy?
Yes, sir. I collected newspapers and iron, steel, and the local junkyard would come and pick it up and pay me a few cents.
All of that for the war effort?
All for the war effort. And what else did we do? Well, everything was rationed, and sugar and butter and stuff was rationed. You had a ration book. I still have some with my name on it and my sister's name on it, and one for my brother and father and mother. We each had separate ones. And your gas was rationed.
Now, how did that affect your dad's business?
Dramatically. He'd get a load of gas, and cars would stand in line till the pumps were dry. And each car had a letter on the front windshield or back windshield that designated how much gas they could buy. Plus, they had the 5-gallon stickers in the book that they could use. But if you were like an A car, you were the average Joe. You can only get 5 gallons a week or something. If you were a doctor, or if you were on the road salesman, you got C or a D.
Gave you more.
Which allowed you to get more gas.
So you decided at what age that you wanted to go into the military sometime?
About 17, 18 when we joined the New Jersey National Guard. About 5 of my buddies and myself all went down and enlisted in the National Guard.
Still in high school?
Yes, still in high school. And I was the only one out of the crowd that ever went active military. They all stayed in the reserves, the 8-year obligation, which was at the time, we were under 8-year obligation in the military. And like I said, I spent 3 years active in the Army. I spent 2 years National Guard prior to the active service, and then after I spent the remainder of the 8 in inactive reserve, fill out my 8-year obligation.
Right. So you were too young for World War II, but the Cold War was going on in the 50s. And did that have any motivation, or was it a question of that you just wanted to do your duty and you wanted to be part of the military?
Well, I always wanted to be part of the military, but also I looked to as an education and as a path for my employment after military, and it worked out well.
Well, you mentioned that you moved to Fort Bragg in North Carolina and at the time. So how old were you when you made that move?
Around 7.
Okay, so
something like that.
So you're in North Carolina, then back to New Jersey.
We went to North Carolina because my mother was from that area, and she was scared because what was going on the coast of New Jersey. My father leased his business out, and we moved to Fayetteville, North Carolina. We lived in a government housing, hastily thrown up housing development, and my father worked out at Fort Bragg in a hospital. He was like a supervisor or something of, I've still got the log books of all the names and the dates they showed up, and their occupation. He kept all that, but we only stayed down there maybe a year and a half, something like that. Then we moved back to New Jersey.
Well, Fort Bragg, of course, was enormously important in World War II, as it has been before that and is now. But you moved then from the coast to a real military town.
Right.
What was that like?
Well, we would sit in our backyard and watch them drop. The drop zone was not so far away. We could watch that.
Watch the airborne troops parachute.
Yeah, paratroop out of the airplanes. And, well, it wasn't so much paratroops where we were. It was mostly cargo drops. They were practicing cargo drops. The personnel drops were somewhere a little ways away. We couldn't see them from our backyard. But it was definitely a military town, and there was military all over the place. And my father worked out there on Fort Bragg, and it was tense times.
So how old were you when you decided that you were going to actually enter the military and enlist?
Well, after the reserves, when I was in the reserves and I graduated high school, I said it's time to join.
So 18, 17?
I was I was 19.
19 years
I
old.
worked a year with on my father's gas station, and then I enlisted in the Army. Before I enlisted, I went out to Fort Monmouth and talked to some of the recruiting people out there, and they told me about the different schools, electronic schools they had at Fort Monmouth, and I selected one and I went and enlisted. And I was guaranteed that school. There was a plan at that time. If you were a high school graduate and you picked a school, you were guaranteed it. Actually, you had a document showing you were destined for that school.
World War II had been over 10 years, and the Korean War had ended about 5 years before that. So it was peacetime, but there was a Cold War going on, big, and would last a long time, and a lot of tension and concerns about that. So how did your folks react when you told them you're joining the military?
They were kind of apprehensive, you know, but they didn't try to stop me at all. And actually, my father wrote our congressman or something. I forget exactly. I think it was a state senator or something like that. And asked his advice, and his advice was just go in for a shorter period of time and get out. I didn't take that approach.
Right. Yeah, you saw the opportunity that was there. Right.
I saw Fort Bragg. I saw all those courses and schools, and I was convinced that was the way for me to go.
So where did you do your basic training?
Fort Dix.
And what was that like?
Cold.
What time of year did you go in?
November, yeah.
Okay.
And, you know, it was very, very cold when you'd laying on the ground searching for mines, you know, and you had to take your gloves off and your hands are freezing, and you're trying to take your knife, what do they call that knife? The bayonet, and kind of go in sideways and feel the mines and stuff. Your fingers almost fall off from the frost. And it was the whole time I was in basic, it was very cold. And when we went out on bivouac, it was super cold. Living in those little tents, you know, it was cold.
Well, how about all that physical training? What was that like?
Built me up. And when I came home, the first to leave was actually in the middle of basic training because it was Christmas. So they gave us a few days off. And where I used to get in the car and drive over to where my buddies lived, I ran over. I was in that good a shape.
Right, right. So from there you went to training in specialty schools?
Fort Bragg.
At Fort Bragg.
I mean Fort Bragg. Fort Monmouth.
Okay, so Fort Monmouth. And what was that training like?
Very intense. I went through 2 schools. I went through microwave radio repair. That was like 22 weeks. And then I wangled, this is very unusual, I wangled my way into a second school, which was Dallas Central Office Maintenance. And there's a story there where I got to know, because my father owned this gas station and garage, I was able to buy stuff at wholesale prices. So I managed to buy stuff for the right people who got me to second school.
And what school was that?
Dallas Central Office Maintenance.
So when did you decide that you wanted to go into the Signal Corps?
Because I lived near Fort Monmouth, I guess when at 19 or when I got ready to enlist, I knew there was a good opportunity to get an education.
And you didn't have a background in electronics or microwave or anything?
No,
like that.
I had a little bit of a desire because I had a friend whose father worked at Fort Monmouth during the Second World War in that industry. He was an electronic engineer, I think was. And I visited him in his home, and it kind of inspired me a little bit.
Okay. Well, and that inspiration was going to take you far away from New Jersey and North Carolina up to Alaska and a focus on how to warn the nation if a nuclear attack was underway. We're going to talk about that when we come back in just a moment.
Military Memoirs is produced by the United Bank Center for Military and Veteran Studies at Coastal Carolina University and is made possible in part by the Lieutenant Tab Stogner Horry County Veterans Oral History Project, which is named in honor of the late H. Otis Tab Stogner, Jr., a World War II veteran of the United States Army. The project records and preserves oral history with Horry County veterans.
They're all around us. They're the men and women who served in our nation's armed forces. In good times and bad, they've been willing to stand in harm's way to preserve, protect, and defend the legacy of freedom we enjoy as Americans. All of them gave some, and some of them gave all. We owe them a lot. So the next time you see an American veteran, say thank you for all of us.
The United Bank Center for Military and Veteran Studies preserves oral history from American veterans of all service branches, including the U.S. Coast Guard. The Hack Mintz U.S. Coast Guard Oral History Project is named in honor of the late Henry Hack Mintz, a longtime resident of Myrtle Beach who held 3 U.S. Coast Guard commands. The Hack Mintz U.S. Coast Guard Oral History Project, a key component of the United Bank Center for Military and Veteran Studies.
Hello and welcome back to Military Memoirs. We're talking to Sam Jones Jr., who was in the U.S. Army Signal Corps during the Cold War. So 1950s, real concern, even more than perhaps now, that we could go to war with Russia, that we might be at war with China, that it could be a nuclear conflict with the Soviet Union, Russia. And you're in the Signal Corps, so the focus there was on warnings and preventive measures to help us if there's a nuclear attack?
Yes, that was definitely the reason for the microwave link from Fort Ritchie to Fort Bragg that I worked on for about a year, and then my service up in Alaska on the DEW line, early warning system up there, yes. Definitely.
So the concept there is we're trying to provide a warning system throughout the continental U.S. and then even in the territories like Alaska at the time, and doing other things. The Eisenhower interstate system.
Yeah.
Eisenhower, of course, saw the Autobahn in Germany, this multi-lane road that Hitler intended for more than just civilian traffic. He was going to move his troops across there, and the Soviets were sitting on that Autobahn on the eastern half of Germany. If they wanted to move tank divisions, they'd move them in there. So here Eisenhower sees that and starts to work as President Eisenhower to develop the interstate system, first of all for military purposes, but it was to benefit all the civilians.
If you remember back when he was a young lieutenant, he accompanied one of the first Army caravans, or whatever you call it, try to go from the East Coast to the West Coast, and it was a disaster. Yeah. And he was involved in that, not planning it, but he was like an observer. That's how he got the idea that we needed some kind of an interstate system.
Yeah, Route 66 sounded good, but it was 2 lanes and you put a column of tanks on it and trucks. It doesn't work so well.
And that only went from halfway across the U.S. It didn't come all the way to the East Coast.
Right.
From St. Louis, I think.
So the idea was to develop, to connect 2 military posts, Fort Dix and Fort Bragg. But everybody was being connected, but you worked on that section, and what was that all about?
Well, it was almost like being a civilian because we just traveled from station to station every 30 miles, and we were on per diem, and we just stayed in the nearest facility we could rent, mostly motels, and we ate on the economy, and we were paid well. In fact, we made a lot of money. Private back then, I was probably a PFC or an E4, and gave us a little extra money, and
this was the military equivalent of overtime.
Yeah, overtime was like, well, you were on duty 24 hours a day, whether you liked it or not, you know.
So you have every 30 miles, you've got basically a booster that boosts the signal between these two military posts.
You had an antenna. Well, there was two crews.
Mm-hmm.
The crew I was in, we installed the microwave equipment in the buildings that were built by the Corps of Engineers, and we would install and then another crew would come along and put in the tower and the antenna and the lead in from the antennas down to our equipment. We would turn the equipment on, see that it was operating, then we would leave, and a permanent crew would come in. But as far as we were concerned, we were just going from every 30 miles putting in equipment.
Right, and this was to give us some protection as a nation.
Yeah.
So you found yourself in Alaska, and you were working on the dew line, or something that I guess was a follow-up to the establishment of the dew line. What was the dew line?
Distant early warning system that went across Alaska and Canada that would detect anything coming over the pole from Russia, what have you. And it was built that it would intercept. You couldn't jam it, in other words, and would intercept any missile. Back then it was bombers, you know, or missiles, maybe missiles, I guess, at that time. And it was like it said, early warning system. Right. And we worked in communications that landline communications back to the U.S. And there was also radio. We didn't work on the radio end of it, I'm sure.
So you worked on something that was codenamed White Alice Project, and that was part of the early warning to help prevent a nuclear attack, right?
The White Alice Project was to tie together the dew line stations back into Fairbanks, Alaska, and then it went landline back to the States. And actually, we worked in conjunction with a Western Electric company. They must have had a contract, and we somehow, while we were up there, our supervisor was a Western Electric employee. When I say supervisor, he told us the work needed to be done. He had no control. We didn't report to him anyway. It was a kind of a joint effort.
So what was your job actually?
A lot of cabling and wiring in different pieces of electronic equipment, and that was basically it. It wasn't very exciting. It wasn't very exciting work, but
well, you make it sound very matter of fact, but the reality of it is that if we had a nuclear war with the Soviet Union, which was a principal concern at that time, then they would have launched a secret flyover the North Pole with long-range bombers, or at that time early intercontinental ballistic missiles.
Correct.
Later on they'd be MIRVed and warheaded, and they'd go in all directions across the country. We had to know that was happening somehow to try to protect ourselves with whatever we could do then. And that's really what you were working on. You were trying to protect the American people from nuclear war.
Definitely, and in the comm center where we worked, there was all kind of devices to, if we were attacked, personnel invaded us up there, we were to chop all the incoming cables and the thermite things that sit on top of all the racks that would actually burn right down through the racks of equipment to destroy everything. So that was present. So you knew there's something going on.
Yeah, I had never thought about that, but part of the concern was that the Soviets might send in some kind of commando strike force to try to knock down the warning system, so that would have a greater advantage if they went to nuclear war.
Yeah, there was an Army and Air Force base right next to where our comm center was. And I think it was Ladd Air Force Base, or I forget, there was the furthest north fighter squadron was stationed there, I think, at that time. So we had access to a military base, but we weren't allowed to live on the base. We had to maintain civilian quarters for some strange reason, because some of our assignments might be in areas where there wasn't a facilities, military. We just happened to be in Fairbanks.
Yeah.
We just happened
Fort
to be.
Richardson or something, right?
No, Fort Richardson was in Anchorage.
Okay, but you were off post doing this.
Oh,
So
we were issued a vehicle, what we call the weapons carrier at that time, a 3/4 ton truck. And we drove from there to Fairbanks, and we had that vehicle at our disposal, and we were basically supposedly living in Fairbanks, but there was Fort whatever it was, it might have been Ladd Air Force Base or something like that, and the Army base that was attached.
So the civilians, their big worry, if they're all, what's on their mind driving around out in the boonies in Alaska, is maybe you'll run into a Kodiak bear or run over a moose. But you're out there and you're thinking about the unthinkable, which is nuclear warfare, the atomic bomb and so on, they called it then. So did it ever at some point just kind of hit you about what you actually were doing and what it meant? Or was it just routine?
No, I don't think. We're kind of blasé, we're a couple of young, by that time I was in E5, and we're just having a good time and doing our duty, and I didn't think too much. Now I'll tell you, when I did think of it, way back when I was still a child, just after the Second World War, sleeping in my upstairs bedroom, I'm right on the beach. It used to bother me then, when all the Cold War stuff was getting started, as to whether we were going to be invaded by the Russians, which was not very practical.
Right, but as a kid.
But as a kid, I laid in the bed worrying about that.
There's a whole generation of kids in the 50s that had that experience.
I worried about that.
Yeah. Well, so you had this remarkable career in the Signal Corps, and you went out. You went in 1955, went out in 1958, and that really prepared you for a career. You told me earlier in the post in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, as a civil engineer with General Electric in various assignments around the world. And you were there for like 40-something years, and along the way you also managed to marry Betty Lovett of North Carolina, and you had 2 sons who went into the military and followed in your footsteps, and then you wound up retiring to Myrtle Beach in 2021. So last question, when you look back at your career, your time in the military, in the Signal Corps, what does it mean to you now when you look back?
Very proud. Very, very proud. Especially that my sons followed sort of in my footsteps in the military career. The electronics part of it, they didn't seem to gravitate to that. They were more in the intelligence end of the military. And no, it was a great opportunity, and I praise the Army and for setting me up for a good career.
So I want to thank you so much for your service, and also thank you for being on this program with us.
I much appreciate it, and I've seen your broadcast, and I never thought I'd be on one.
Well, we're glad you chose to do that, and thank you for contacting us.
Thank you.
And we want to thank you too for joining us for Military Memoirs.
The preceding program is made possible by the generous support of these sponsors: Conway Ford, dedicated to serving our communities and our veterans in Horry, Georgetown, and Marion counties. By PGBA, the health claims processor for the American Armed Forces, serving those who serve us. And by United Bank, with full-service banking for our community and our veterans from convenient locations.